Hello everyone! Today we're diving into the fascinating story of the Frisians, an ancient ethnic group from the coastal regions of the Netherlands, northwestern Germany, and southern Denmark. Now these folks have a pretty interesting history, stretching back to the early Middle Ages when they lived in what's now Belgium too. The Frisians call a region known as Frisia their home, which includes parts of the Dutch provinces of Friesland and Groningen, as well as East Frisia and North Frisia in Germany. Fun fact, North Frisia used to be part of Denmark until 1864. Now, where did the name Frisians come from? There are a few theories. The Romans called a Germanic tribe in the area the Frisia or Frisians, but that tribe vanished in the 5th century before the Frisians showed up. One theory suggests that the name might come from the Latin word frisere, meaning to mill, cut, or groove, referring to the Frisians' habit of digging ditches and dikes to manage the marshy land they lived on. Another idea is that it's linked to braided hair, which could have been a distinctive feature of the people back then. The Frisian languages are still spoken today by more than 500,000 people. West Frisian is officially recognized in the Netherlands, and North Frisian and Saterland Frisian have official status in Germany as regional languages. Going back in time, before the modern Frisians emerged, the ancient Frisia appeared in Roman records during a war in 12 BC. They occasionally popped up in stories of Roman conflicts with Germanic tribes, even helping the Romans as cavalry during the invasion of Britain. But after the Batavi revolt around 70 AD, the Frisia kind of disappeared from the record until 296 AD, when they were deported into Roman territory as serfs. Some of them ended up in Flanders and Kent, probably under Roman pressure. Frisia itself faced some tough times between the 3rd and 5th centuries due to rising sea levels and a colder, wetter climate, making the area almost unlivable. The population dwindled, and for a couple of centuries, the coastal lands were nearly deserted. But as conditions improved, new settlers, mostly Angles and Saxons, moved in. These newcomers eventually became known as the Frisians, though they weren't necessarily descended from the original Frisia. These new Frisians are the ancestors of the medieval and modern-day Frisians. By the end of the 6th century, Frisian territory expanded, and by the 7th century it stretched all the way to Dorstad. This larger area is sometimes called Frisia Magna. The Frisians had their own high king, with the first mention of a Frisian king dating back to 678. In the early 8th century, the Frisians still worshipped Germanic gods like Thor and Odin, especially outside Utrecht. But as time passed, conflicts with the Franks in the south led to a series of wars, and by 734, the Franks had conquered Frisia. This conquest paved the way for Anglo-Irish missionaries like Saint Boniface to convert the Frisians to Christianity, a mission that Saint Willibrord mostly succeeded in. After Charlemagne's death, the Frisian lands were theoretically under the control of the Count of Holland, but in practice, the Hollandic counts struggled to assert their authority. This led to a period known as the Frisian Freedom, where feudalism and serfdom didn't exist, and the Frisian lands only owed allegiance to the Holy Roman Emperor. However, by the 13th century, the Counts of Holland began to regain power. Starting in 1272, they sought to re-establish control over the Frisian lands through a series of wars that, despite interruptions, eventually resulted in the conquest of Western Frisia by 1122. This also marked the rise of a more powerful noble class in central and eastern Frisia. In 1524, Frisia became part of the 17 provinces, and later joined the Dutch revolt against Spanish rule in 1568. Central Frisia has been part of the Netherlands ever since, while the eastern parts became part of various German states and Denmark. An old tradition in the region involved exploiting peatlands. When it comes to migration, many Frisians were part of the wave of ethnic groups that settled in England alongside the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, starting around the 5th century. They mainly settled in Kent, East Anglia, the East Midlands, Northeast England, and Yorkshire. Evidence of their presence includes place names like Frisinghall in Bradford and Freeston in Lincolnshire. Interestingly, there are similarities in dialect between Great Yarmouth and Friesland, likely due to trade during the Middle Ages. The Frisians also founded the Freston area of Ipswich. In Scotland, colonies of Angles and Frisians settled as far north as the River Forth, corresponding to areas that were historically part of Northumbria. And now let's talk about the presence of Frisians in Denmark. The earliest traces of them in what is now Denmark go back to the 8th century, when Frisian traders and craftsmen started settling in Ribe. Later, during the Middle Ages, Frisian farmers moved into the Tundermarsken area, west of Tunner. You can actually still see evidence of this today in the form of dwelling mounds or terps in the area. These mounds were built using the same techniques as those found along the Wadden Sea further south. During the 12th or 13th century, more settlers from the south established themselves in Misthusum, within the Balham marshes near Scarebeck. By around 1400, documents suggest that at least some of these settlers were referred to as Hollanders, indicating a connection to the broader Frisian identity. However, over time, Frisian culture in Denmark became pretty assimilated. Nowadays, most people of Frisian descent in Denmark don't really identify as Frisians. When it comes to the Frisian language, it's rarely spoken as a first language anymore. Traditionally, it was spoken in a few small communities near the German border, but that's not very common today. Some estimates suggest there are between 2,000 and 5,000 people of Frisian descent in Denmark, though that number might be a bit of an overestimate. In the early 20th century, there were some efforts to promote Frisian identity in Denmark. One notable figure was Cornelius Petersen, a farmer and political activist from Eiderstedt, who built a traditional Frisian farmstead in Mogultonder in 1914 and founded a rural protest movement known as Farmers' Self-Government. More recently, a retired journalist named Benny Sivertsen wrote a pamphlet on Frisian heritage in Denmark, trying to revive some awareness of this identity. Now, when it comes to language, the Frisian languages are quite interesting. Historically, the Anglo-Saxons of England and the early Frisians came from similar tribal backgrounds, so their languages were quite similar, both forming part of the Anglo-Frisian language family. Old Frisian is actually the closest related language to Old English. In modern times, Frisian dialects are still the closest languages to contemporary English that don't come directly from Old English, though they aren't mutually intelligible. Frisian is split into 3 different languages: West Frisian, Saterland Frisian, and North Frisian. Each of these is quite different from the others, so much so that they can't really be understood by speakers of the other Frisian languages. West Frisian is spoken mostly in the Dutch province of Friesland, with around 350,000 native speakers, and when you include speakers in neighboring Groningen province, the number goes up to about 470,000. Unlike the other 2 Frisian languages, West Frisian isn't considered endangered, though some research has suggested that this assumption might need to be re-evaluated. Saterland Frisian, spoken in the German municipality of Saterland, has around 2,000 speakers, while North Frisian, spoken on the west coast of Jutland in the German region of North Frisia, has about 10,000 speakers. Both of these languages are considered endangered. Nowadays there's a clear division among the Frisians, north, east, and west, largely because of the historical loss of Frisian territory during the Middle Ages. The West Frisians, for the most part, don't see themselves as part of a larger Frisian group. In fact, a poll from 1970 showed that they identify more with the Dutch than with the East or North Frisians.